What does Idaho have to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Well, our small state has more of a role to play in shaping US foreign policy than you might think. Our very own Senator Jim Risch is the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So in this video, I want to highlight how our senator is leading the Republicans in advising the president on what our policy should be toward Russia and Ukraine. And then I want to talk about two questions that you might have about this conflict. Namely, number one, who is even responsible for this? Can we blame Joe Biden for the war? And number two, why should we as Americans even care? Why not bury our head in the sand and mind our own business? But first, let me talk about what our senator is proposing we should do in order to help stop the Russian advance into Ukraine. About a week ago, our senator introduced a bill called the NYET Act, Never Yielding Europe's Territory Act, which imposes strong economic sanctions on Russia. And it has three key elements to it. First, Senator Risch is calling for heavier sanctions on Russia. And by that, he means heavier sanctions on the Russian banks. And then he's calling for secondary sanctions on other institutions and businesses that continue to deal with these banks that have been sanctioned by Russia. And then number three, he's calling for an immediate stop on all construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, Nord Stream 2 is very important in understanding the entire conflict, so I'll come back to that in a moment and explain what he means by that. Number two, our senator is proposing that we support Ukraine more fully. He believes we should give the country $500 million in military aid so they can be better equipped to fight the Russians. He also believes we should create a new Ukraine resistance fund, which would help Ukraine moving forward to defend itself against further Russian aggression should Putin decide to sweep across the entire country of Ukraine. So in addition to targeting Russia and giving assistance to Ukraine, Senator Risch is also calling on the US government to combat Russian influence in Russia and elsewhere. And what he means by this is he believes the US should fund an effort to combat Russian propaganda in Europe and in other countries. And he believes the US should help other countries strengthen their own defenses so that they can defend themselves against further Russian aggression should that happen sometime in the future. So that's the key role that Idaho has been playing in leading the Republican Party in trying to influence the US foreign policy in the Russia-Ukrainian war. So what I want to do next is answer two questions that you may have about this Russian-Ukrainian conflict. The first of which is, who's to blame? Can we blame Joe Biden for this war? Now, before I continue, if this video has been helpful or valuable, tap the like button so that YouTube knows that people are enjoying the video. And it also helps me to know that you like this type of content as well. Now, I don't want to assign blame where no blame is due. And ultimately, each person is responsible for his or her own actions. So Putin is responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But in researching the issue a bit further, I think there are two things that Biden did which may have encouraged Putin's aggressive ambitions. Number one, our departure from Afghanistan was viewed by many, not only in the United States, but abroad as a total flop. To many people, our departure from Afghanistan looked as if we left the country with our tail between our legs. And we left the country in a not much better state than it was 20 years earlier when we went into Afghanistan. So many people are saying that Putin took measure of Biden during this Afghanistan withdrawal and determined that he was weak. And for a hawk like Putin, a weak United States leader is exactly what he wants so that he can continue his imperialistic ambitions. The second thing that Joe Biden did is he waived the Nord Stream 2 pipeline sanctions 4 days after he took office. Now, this is a very important element in this entire conflict, so let me just take a minute to explain the significance of this. Ukraine has always been the breadbasket of Europe. It has rich, dark soils, huge farmlands, huge wheat fields. When it was part of the Soviet Union, it alone provided 25% of the total agricultural output. So Putin has been eyeing Ukraine for quite some time in his ambition to rebuild the USSR. He knows that in order to rebuild the Soviet Union, he needs to control Ukraine to sustain a Soviet economy. Russia's biggest export is oil and natural gas. But to get the natural gas to Europe, he has to pipe it through a pipeline that cuts directly through Ukraine. So invading Ukraine risks damaging or destroying this pipeline, which would then cut off his exports and therefore cripple his economy. So that's why, if you remember, Putin took Crimea in 2014. That's that southern peninsula in Ukraine, but he stopped right there. So what he did in 2015 is he started building another pipeline called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which cuts through the bottom of the ocean directly from Russia over to Germany and totally bypasses Ukraine. So once that Nord Stream 2 pipeline is complete, Russia will be totally independent of Ukraine and will therefore be free to invade the country and do as he pleases there and not have to worry about possibly damaging a pipeline there, which could then have economic consequences on Russia. The Western world has known exactly what Putin has been up to in this Nord Stream 2 pipeline deal. So in 2019, Senator Ted Cruz authored a bill that was signed into law with overwhelming bipartisan support, which sanctioned the building of this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And on the very day that it was signed into law by President Donald Trump, construction of this Nord Stream 2 pipeline stopped. But fast forward to 2021. Joe Biden becomes president on January 20th, and 4 days later, January 24th, construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline resumes. Putin knew that the US was no longer going to enforce the sanctions on this pipeline. And then later on that year, President Biden formally rescinded the sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline by signing an executive order. Now, this pipeline is very important in this conflict because it not only allows Russia to bypass Ukraine and allows Russia to do as it pleases in that country, but it also increases European dependence on Russian oil and natural gas. Currently, they have extremely high energy prices in Europe and historically low natural gas reserves. So this presents Putin with the perfect opportunity to use this pipeline as a tool to get whatever he wants. And I think it's interesting that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was just completed in September, and now several months later, he invades Ukraine. But that's not the end of the whole Nord Stream 2 pipeline story. Even though the pipeline was completed in September, there are still a number of inspections and permits that need to be issued by Europe in order to make the pipeline fully functional. So the pipeline can still be leveraged a bit in order to get Putin to back out of Ukraine. And who knows, maybe that's what Putin will choose to do if he ever gets cornered. He may say that he'll choose to back out of Ukraine on the condition that Nord Stream 2 is issued all the permits and inspections that are required in order to make it fully functional. But the second question I want to ask is, why should we even care about what happens in Russia and Ukraine? Russia's a long ways away from America. Why not just bury our head in the sand and mind our own business? Well, the US does have a national interest in keeping Russia weak. Putin has been very vocal about what his national ambitions are. He wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. And there was a point in history when there was a Soviet Union. And at that point, there were two major superpowers in the world, the US and the Soviet Union. And what was life like when there were two major superpowers? Life was more dangerous. That's what the whole Cold War was about. So it's in our national interest to keep Russia weak, because if Russia takes Ukraine, Putin will only be more emboldened to carry out his imperialistic ambitions to rebuild the Soviet Union, and that will lead to, once again, there being two superpowers in the world, which will make the world a more dangerous place.